they gave it to Bugner, so that was it. I said, right, I'll retire.
Well, let me take you back to 1963 and the first fight against Cassius Clay at Wembley Stadium.
Yeah.
Was that the most perfect left hook?
Well, I think it was one of them. I've thrown about, I suppose, 5 great left hooks in my career, and that was definitely one of the great ones. When you throw a left hook, and it's, you play golf now, Dick, when you get that one out the sweet spot and it goes 250. When I hit him with this left hook here, I knew he was in trouble. Eyes tell you everything in boxing, and I knew his eyes had gone. If you look at where I hit him, I hit him too close to the ropes, and the ropes let him down gently from the top, middle to the bottom. Now, if I'd have knocked him perhaps down in the centre of the ring, and he'd have gone down and hit his head and shook his head. And Angelo Dundee, I must say, I've had dinner with him on a couple of occasions since then, he always says that he was in trouble. And you can see there where they break the file under his nose, which was strictly illegal in them days. And then you can see this is pointing the split glove, which no one saw in the previous round. So it must have been, and Angelo Dundee openly admitted to me that when he came back to the ring, he said, I had less than 50 seconds to recover him. He said, and I knew I wasn't going to recover him, so I had to do something to get time for him to recover.
In fact, that interval lasted well over 2 minutes, didn't it?
Oh, 2.5 minutes. See, because in them days, they didn't have second sets of gloves at ringside. From that fight onwards, they have second sets of gloves under the ring now. So what the referee did, he went to the steward in charge who sat at ringside. Steward in charge had to send someone back to the chief whip in the dressing room, get another set of gloves. By the time he got back, he had a 2.5 minute interval. Now, to a fit guy, that's a lifetime.
So it was a badly cut eye, a very bad one too.
Oh, yeah.
And then 3 years later, the same ending. But of course, he was a much shrewder fighter by this time, much more experienced, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. See, in the first fight in '63, I messed Ali about inside. He was quite amateurish at inside fighting in them days, and I messed him out. I had his nose bleeding in the first round. But the second fight, he'd been well schooled and he'd well learned, because directly I got into any sort of a clinch with him, it was whop. It was just like being in a vice. He had the longest reach in boxing, and his arms wrapped around you like an octopus, and I couldn't move. And he was just waiting for the referee to say break, and as he said break, he pushed me back and jumped back himself. Oh, yeah, he'd well learned. Yeah.
2 bad cut eyes. They were always a problem. Why were your eyes so vulnerable, Henry?
Well, basically because, we've got the typical sort of white man's skull, prominent cheekbone and eyebrow. See, and they would see, and we've got very sharp bone. Now, brother George, bless his heart, he suffered from cuts worse than I did. He boxed as a pro for 9 or 10 years, but he had some terrible worse cuts than I ever had, And the doctor said to him, you only had to tap him on the eye, and the skin would cut because the bone was sharp, would come through. And same with me, I had similar trouble. But it's just a physical thing, how you're made.
You mentioned George, who was boxing as Jim, but
Brother
where
Jim.
did your love of boxing, how did it start?
Well, it was in family, in Dad's side of the family. Dad did a bit of boxing. He was a boy soldier in the First World War sort of thing, and he did a bit of boxing, and he went into 1 or 2 competitions at the old National Sporting Club. But Grandad, his father was an old bare-knuckle fighter, so I never knew Grandad because he was dead years before we were born. Now, the Cooper family came from the Elephant Castle in them days, which was a tough old area in them days. Tough now, not so good now, but it was tougher in them days. And they used to have an horse depository there where all the Diddy-Kais and Jibbos and farmers used to come up from Kent to buy and sell horses. Well, Grandad, being Irish, he knew a bit about horses, and he used to earn a few bob there, like running his hands over, looking at their teeth. No, don't buy it, or yes, it's a good buy it. And I used to tip him, and Dad used to say, we used to eat well sometimes. Grandad used to come in where he'd been a bare knuckle fighter, and he smashed his hands up bad in the winter. He couldn't put his hand. He'd say to my dad, "Son, put your hand in there," and Dad used to put his hand, pull it out, and sometimes he'd find half a sovereign. Now he said, "Blowy, we knew we were going to eat well that week."
So you'd got that love of boxing, but how did you foster it? Was it the Bellingham Boxing Club?
Yeah, the old Bellingham Amateur Boxing. Now we had a great trainer there, Matt Wells, who was a British lightweight champion. Now, dear old Matt, he had the best 2 cauliflower ears you've ever seen, and yet, see, people who don't know boxing, they'd look at Matt and say, "God, look at him, he must have took a belt in his," and he didn't. He was only clever boxers got cauliflower ears.
Why's that?
Well, see, because if you remember the old days, the laces were exposed on the inside of the glove. Now, clever fighters, when they see a punch coming, they go like that, and it was a rubbing movement with the lace on the ear. You'd never get a cauliflower with a direct punch. It's a rubbing, like rugby players. When they go down, it's a rubbing. And that, you only see cauliflower ears with rugby players. Now, boxers, they're not too clever, but...
But you had a very successful amateur career, didn't you? I mean, two ABA titles?
Yeah, I won the ABAs in 52 and 53, once in Civvy Street and then once through the Army. I won that in the Army in 53.
Well, what was it that convinced you that you really couldn't make it in the professional ranks?
Well, I'd been to Olympic Games, I'd been to European Championships. I didn't do particularly well in any of those big competitions, but I'd fought all top-class amateur. I mean, I beat Tony Madigan, who was an Australian Olympic champion. He won the Golden Gloves Championships in America, and I give him a boxing lesson and beat him in the ABAs in 1953. So, I was good enough to say, well, let's turn pro. And see, because in them days, amateurs, we used to get top in the bill. Like in them days, we get a canteen of cutlery, or we get a coffee percolator, and well, I thought I owned a jeweller's shop at home because I must have had like 20 or 30 canteens of cutlery and coffee percolator, and we were selling them for about £3 a piece. I thought, we might as well earn some money and make it pay, like turn pro.
Well, the man that guided you through your professional career was Jim Wicks, or the Bishop, or Seamus, as you called him. How did you two get together?
Well, there used to be a great old pressman years ago. His name was J.T. Oles, not Sidney Oles. It was J.T. Oles. He used to write in the Evening News all about amateur boxing. Him and dear old Wally Boltman used to go around together, and they covered all the amateur shows in London. And he used to live in South East London, J.T. Oles, and he always said to me, he said, son, he said, if ever you think of turning pro, there's only one man to go with, and that's Jim Wicks. And that was the best advice I'd ever... If anyone says to me, what was the best advice you ever had in your life, and that was to go to Jim, as asking him to be my manager, and which we did.
Because most managers buy the people they want, as they pay them money to come and join them. But
Jim Wicks would never bought a fighter in his life.
Why is that?
He always said if a manager buys a fight, well, the only thing he's going to concentrate on is to get his money back. And Jim Wicks would never do that. Jim Wicks, he was a lovely character. Jim Wicks basically, for my first 10 fights, he never stopped his commission. He never stopped his 25% commission, which he was entitled to. Me, Jim, all these boxers, until we were earning hundreds of pounds, he wouldn't take his commission. But now, if he'd have bought us, if he'd have paid like 5 or 10 grand to buy us, he'd have been like most managers, they want to cop their 25% to get their money back. They're thinking that way.
Now, you started very well. I think you won your first 9 fights, didn't you?
Yeah, at the old Aaron Gay Arena.
Then you followed that with a dicey period, didn't you?
Yeah, I had 3 fights. I can't think what... I think it was like Ingemar Johansson, I think I lost to. Then it was Joe Bygraves.
For the British title?
For the British title. And then I lost to Erskine.
In an eliminator?
In an eliminator for the British title. And see, I couldn't make out what was going wrong because, see, if I'd have been playing around, hadn't been training properly, playing around, I could have understood it. But, I mean, I was conscientious, I was young, I was in the gym every day, working hard, sparring, but nothing would go right. So Jim... He said to me, because Jim was lovely, I mean, he said, look, son, he said, you've got to learn to relax. I was getting uptight because I was getting little cuts and little nicks. I was getting uptight. And he said, what I'll do, he said, no one wanted to use me, basically. None of the British promoters wanted to because I'd lost 3 fights. So what we had to do is go and establish ourselves somewhere. So we went to Germany. Now, I had 3 fights. I fought Hans Kapfel, who was the German heavyweight champ. He was about 6'4" and about 17 stone, and I boxed him in Dortmund, and I give him a boxing lesson for 10 rounds, boxed his ears off, and all the Germans picked me up and said, wunderbar, walk me around this. I thought, yeah, this is good, we'll come back here again. And then they had the old European heavyweight champ, a fellow called Heinz Neuhaus. Neuhaus, who was an old European German champ. He was getting on a bit. Now, I've given him a boxing lesson.
But I heard that you went over there to see this professor who was going to teach you how to relax.
Oh, relax? Yeah, well, it did, yeah. Jim gave this story to the press, yeah. He was about, like, 20, and it was female, but it was very good. No, only joking, but...
No. But what was the turning point? Because you did come back, and there had to be a turning point.
Yeah. Well, the turning point basically was then I'd got confidence in the last two fights out there. I thought Neuhaus had got a draw, knocked a fella out called Eric Struppner, who was the biggest draw in Germany in them days. They were building him up to fight Archie Moore for the world light heavyweight title, and I knocked him out and they disqualified me. But anyway, I got my confidence back, and then I fought Dick Richardson at Porthcawl down in South Wales, and I knocked him out in 5 rounds. And then after that, the career just went steadily along. Nicely.
And Brian London for the title, for the first
Yeah,
title.
well, I beat Brian 3 times, so I won him outright, but I haven't got him on the mantel shelf, thank you.
But a thrill it must have been to win the British title for the first time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a shame, I think, modern-day British heavyweights, they've sort of rubbished the British heavyweight championship. When I was a kid and when I turned pro, I wanted to win a Lonsdale belt. Christ, that was my first. I wanted to win 1 outright, or I went on and won 3 outright, which was marvellous.
What was your schedule in those days? What, 4 or 5 fights a year or less?
No, well, I mean, when I was champion, you couldn't afford to. No, you could see people. I only used to fight twice a year. People used to say, "Why don't you fight more?" I said, "Well, I can go out in the street and get punched on the nose for nothing." I mean, we had a tax system in this country. I mean, every pound, I'm talking about old money now, every pound I earned in them days when I was champion, I was paying 16 and 9pence, nearly 17 shillings tax. 16, my highest rate of tax, when I fought Ali for the world title the second time, that I was the highest paid British fighter. The previous highest paid British fighter before me was Randolph Turpin. When he fought Sugar Ray Robinson for the world middleweight title, his fight was worth 70,000 quid to him on paper. When I fought Ali the second time for the world title, that was worth 80,000 quid to me. You know how much I saw out of that?
No.
14,000 quid. I was lucky to see 14,000 quid.
And that was after the tax and all your expenses?
Well, all the expenses, the tax. I was lucky to fight to keep 14. I didn't see 14,000 quid of it. No.
I think one of the fights that I remember particularly was against Zora Foley.
Zora
World number 3 at that point, wasn't he?
Well, he was joint number 1 actually with Eddie Machin for the world title.
How did that happen?
Well, I mean, Jim Wicks, Solomon's, I think it was Solomon, or was it Levine then? I'm not sure. It could have been for Levine. Levine said, no, would we fight him? We said yes. And he was a dangerous fighter, Zora Foley. He was, I mean, he was never the same when he fought Ali, but when I fought him, he was young. He was fighting like, to win the title off of, what's his name? Floyd Patterson was champion in them days, but he was a box puncher. He was a great boxer, looked good, good jabber, and an hell of a right hand punch. And I can remember he hit me with a right hand punch in the first fight, and I thought, yeah, keep on my old bite and give him the left hand, which I did. And I boxed his ears on. I thought, all right, the second one I hadn't trained properly, and he beat me, but he was a dangerous fighter.
You mentioned the 2 guys, Solomons, who promoted certainly your first fights, and then Harry Levine. How do you think those 2 guys would have fared against someone like Don King?
Well, I think, they were hard men themselves. They'd have stood their ground with him, because they were pretty shrewd men. See, Solomons came onto the scene just after the Second World War, when there was a lot of black money going around in them days. He was a good showman. He was the first promoter to dress the ringside, where everyone who sat ringside for the first 6 rows had to come in dinner jackets. Levine was a different character. Levine was an hard man, businessman. You had to argue, to wrangle to get Jim had to argue with him to get every pound out, a shilling out of him. But once you shook hands with him, you done a deal, your money was there. Solomons was slightly different. See, Solomons, he would say, yeah, all right, we'll give you that. And then if only like he had a bad house, he'd come to her, he'd cry, oh, Jim, you've got to take less. There was not a full house. Oh, and he was moaning. Totally different characters, but 2 great showmen in the game.
But Jim was up to that, wasn't he?
Oh, Jim, I mean, Jim had been mixed with him. Jim was in bookmaking and boxing all his life. I mean, Jim had made a book on every track in the country. He knew all them guys like William Hill, Jack Swift, Solomons, all ended up like millionaire bookmakers. Jim, years ago, taught them all how to reckon bets and more or less...
Well, I tell you one thing. I remember you coming to the World of Sport studio, and we fixed it up with Jim Wicks, and Jim Wicks said... You'll come and I'll come as long as you've got 2 television sets, one on BBC and one on ITV, so I can watch the racing.
Yeah. Oh, well, he had the blower, Jim. He turned from being a bookmaker to a professional punter. I mean, Jim had the blower in his house. What they have in a betting shop, he had it put in his house. so he could get all the latest prices of horses.
Now, you mentioned Floyd Patterson, and you had a fight with him.
Yeah.
That was a sobering experience, wasn't it?
It was. Well, see, what he got. See, people say to me, Ali was the fastest. Well, perhaps he was the fastest moving heavyweight of all time. No heavyweight ever moved as fast as Ali did, or ever likely to in the future. But what I would always put, Floyd Patterson had as fast or faster hands than Ali did. And he was a better one single puncher. See, Ali, basically, because he was moving so fast on the balls of his feet and jumping around, he never got leverage off the ground. So when he hit you, he wasn't like a devastating one knockout punch merchant. All right, he'd hit you with about, he used to hit all them big guys who were a bit slow, who used to look marvellous again. He'd hit them with about 6 or 8 punches, stun them, they didn't know where it was, and the referee had to jump in and stop. But Patterson was a better one punch merchant, and he had a hell of a good left hook, and I'd hurt Patterson to the body once or twice, and I could hear him grunting that, and in the 5th round he's hit me with a left hook, which was I'd have been proud of a throw, I'll tell you. And you know, unfortunately I got up, but I was a bit groggy and the referee had to stop it, but it was a shame.
How would you rate Ali? Would you say that he was the greatest ever?
I always think that's hard. You know, the greatest tribute you can pay to any athlete is to say he was the best of his era, and undoubtedly Ali was. He was the greatest of his era. I would put him in the top 5. You know, I would say Johnson, Dempsey, Louis, Marciano, and Ali. They would have been the 5 in my mind greatest heavyweights of all time. They'd have serviced whatever era they'd have boxed in. They'd have come to the top because they all had boxing brains. They had some of them were great punchers. Someone like Ali had great mobility and speed and cat-like reflexes. So you know, and that's the greatest tribute you can pay to them all.
You didn't ever feel that you'd like to nibble Clay's ear or Ali's ear, did you?
You wouldn't have had long enough chance to bite his bleeding ears. He was always on the move. I mean, when I fought him in '63 and '66, I mean, he didn't stay still in a 3-minute round for 2 seconds. I mean, he was on the move all the time.
But I'm talking really, joking, but I'm talking about Tyson.
Yeah.
I mean, can you believe things like that happening now?
No, well, I can't believe it. I mean, see, if a European fighter had done that, if I'd have done that, I'd have been banned for the rest of my life. We'd have been, if you'd have bit someone's ear off in a British ring, the Border Control would have banned you. And quite rightly, you should be. You should be banned. See, but now, because Tyson basically is managed by Don King. Don King's a very powerful guy in American boxing. He's earning millions of dollars out of Tyson. He's not going to let the Nevada state ban him for life. You just hear you take revoke his license. That's all they've done is revoked his license for a year. He'll get his license back in a
He'll box again, do you think?
Oh, of course he will. Yeah. Don King won't allow them to ban him for the rest of his life.
I tell you what it reminds me, was you were in line for a world title fight against, well, certainly a world title eliminator, I think, against Jimmy Ellis. And that
was going to be billed as a world title fight.
Was it a world title fight?
Yeah. See, because if you remember, Ali was I'm not sure, WBC, and Ellis was WBA champion, and that was the first time, and the Border Control wouldn't allow. That's why I gave up my British title as a token of, because the Border Control in them days was taking 10% of my money, top of the bill, literally for doing nothing. And yet when I had a chance to fight for a world title, and Levine wanted to bill it as a world title fight, he didn't want it billed as a final eliminator. He wanted it billed as a world title fight, and the board wouldn't give him permission. So he called the fight off, and that's why we handed back the British heavyweight title. In them days, I mean, when I was boxing, if you got the opportunity to fight for a world title, you had that once in your life. Now, I mean, you can fight for this one, you don't win that, you fight for another one. If you don't win that, you can fight for another one. You get 4 chances. I'd have been a double world champion if I'd had 4 chances.
You would. But you did win the British title back again, and of course it was another of your many fights against Joe Erskine, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, dear old Joe, see, he was a great... You mentioned in a little bit before that we had 5 fights. We had 8 fights as an amateur and a pro, and I came out winning 5-3 out of the 8 fights. Now, Joe Erskine, if he could have punched, he'd have been a world champion. He'd have been a world champion. He was the best. There was a light heavyweight, which Angelo Dunn had, who was... they all thought he was the best thing on 2 legs, a man called Willie Pastrana.
Oh,
now, Willie Pastrana, I sparred with him. I'd done, 50, 60, 70, 80 rounds sparring with him when he first came to London. And then they made a match with Pastrano and Joe Erskine. and the press came to me and said, look, they've made it, who's going to win? I said, who's going to win? I said, bleeding Erskine, the box, he's here. I said, he won't see which way. They said, you mean it? I said, of course I believe me. I said, Erskine knows more about boxing than his little finger. Well, when they matched them, here, Pastrana didn't see which way Erskine went. I mean, God, he boxed, and they all thought Pastrana was the best thing on two legs.
Actually, you're quite good mates, weren't you? Because he had all these fights.
Oh, lovely. Well.
But once in the ring, of course, naturally.